A millionaire took a homeless girl to a business meeting. What she did stunned everyone. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the sidewalks as Smith Harrison stepped out of his black Rolls-Royce. His custom-tailored suit remained untouched by the downpour, thanks to the umbrella held over his head by his assistant. With a sigh of impatience, he checked his Patek Philippe watch. 7 minutes until his meeting with the investors. He didn't have time for distractions. Yet, just as he turned towards the revolving glass doors of the hotel, something, or rather, someone, caught his eye. A girl, barely in her 20s, sat curled up against the cold concrete wall, her tattered hoodie soaked through, strands of her dark hair sticking to her pale face. Her eyes, piercing and defiant, locked onto his as she clutched a cardboard sign with shaking hands. Not asking for money, just a chance. Smith scoffed internally. Another desperate plea, another lost cause. "Keep walking, sir," his assistant muttered, but something made Smith pause. Maybe it was the sheer boldness in her gaze, or maybe, for the first time in years, he felt curious. Without thinking, he stepped closer. A chance for what? The girl lifted her chin. "To prove I'm worth more than this." A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Then prove it." And just like that, in the next 5 minutes, Smith made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Smith Harrison wasn't just a millionaire, he was a millionaire. A man who built his empire from the ground up. He had a reputation for being ruthless in business and indifferent to people's emotions. Deals were made based on numbers, not sentiment. And yet, as he stood before the drenched homeless girl, something about her defiance intrigued him. She wasn't begging. She wasn't desperate. She was daring him. Smith glanced back at the entrance of the five-star hotel where his business meeting awaited. Investors from Tokyo and London were waiting to finalize a $1 million expansion deal. They expected precision, professionalism, and above all, control. Smith was known for being the most composed man in any room. But now, standing in the rain, he was about to do something completely out of character. He extended a hand. "Stand up." The girl hesitated, searching his face for mockery, but found none. Slowly, she took his hand, her fingers cold and calloused against his warm, polished skin. "What's your name?" he asked as they walked toward the entrance. "Emily." "No last name?" "Does it matter?" she shot back, her voice laced with challenge. Smith smirked. He liked her already. As they stepped inside, heads turned. A man like Smith Harrison didn't associate with people like her. His assistant, Greg, leaned in, whispering urgently, "Sir, this is a bad idea. The investors—" "Let them wonder," Smith interrupted. The meeting room was lined with suits and power players, their expressions a mix of confusion and skepticism as Smith walked in, Emily trailing behind him. He could almost hear their thoughts. Who is she? Why is she here? Smith took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table. "Let's begin," he announced. A gray-haired investor from Tokyo adjusted his tie. "And who is this?" he asked, nodding at Emily. Smith leaned back in his chair. "An observer," he said nonchalantly. "Thought I'd bring in a fresh perspective." Emily said nothing, but Smith could feel the weight of her silence. She wasn't just observing, she was studying them. Every nod, every skeptical glance, every subtle shift in posture. Smith had no idea if she would sink or swim. But one thing was certain. He'd just placed a bet on the most unpredictable player in the room. And if she failed, she'd do it in front of some of the most powerful people in the world. The silence in the boardroom stretched for a few uncomfortable seconds before the Tokyo investor, Mr. Tanaka, cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrison, I assume this observer has some experience in high-level business negotiations?" Smith smirked, glancing at Emily. "Experience? Not in the traditional sense, but she has something more valuable, an unfiltered perspective." A murmur spread across the table. The executives exchanged glances, clearly unconvinced. Greg, Smith's assistant, shifted nervously, tapping his tablet as if silently pleading with his boss to stop this madness. Emily, however, remained silent, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She wasn't intimidated. If anything, she looked amused. "So," Smith continued, "shall we get started?" The discussion kicked off, with the investors outlining their terms for the expansion deal. Numbers were thrown around, hundreds of millions, projected profits, risk assessments. Smith countered their concerns with his usual calculated confidence, but throughout the meeting, Emily sat still, arms crossed, observing. Until suddenly, she spoke. "That's not going to work." The room froze. Smith turned to her, eyebrow raised. "Care to elaborate?" Emily leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wood. "You're planning to expand into international markets with an aggressive strategy, assuming customer loyalty will transfer across cultures. But your data is flawed. You're using U.S. consumer behavior as a model for Japan and Europe, but that's a mistake." Mr. Tanaka's eyes narrowed. "And what makes you say that?" Emily shrugged. "People in Tokyo aren't going to respond to the same marketing strategies you use in New York. And Europeans are skeptical of rapid corporate expansion. If you go in too aggressively, you'll alienate them before you even start." The room fell into stunned silence. Greg's face paled. This was $1 million deal, one Smith had spent months negotiating. And now, a homeless girl, someone who had slept on the streets just hours ago, was poking holes in their strategy. Smith studied Emily, suppressing a grin. She had guts, that was for sure. But she had also just declared war against some of the most powerful businessmen in the world. Mr. Tanaka steepled his fingers. "And what would you suggest, Miss Emily?" She didn't hesitate. "Localized brand integration. Instead of forcing an American strategy, adapt the expansion to align with cultural norms in each region. Hire local marketing teams, collaborate with influencers, and establish trust before making aggressive moves." A long pause followed. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Tanaka nodded slowly. "Interesting." Smith turned to Greg, who looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "See? Fresh perspective." The meeting continued, but tension in the room had shifted. The investors were no longer just entertaining Smith. They were watching Emily, testing her. And Smith wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a terrible mistake. The meeting ended, and as the investors left, murmuring amongst themselves, Greg pulled Smith aside. "This is insane," he hissed. "You just gambled $1 million deal on a girl you met in the rain." Smith glanced at Emily, who was now inspecting the grand chandelier as if she belonged in the room. "She knows what she's talking about." Greg scoffed. "Maybe. But do you realize how bad this looks? People are already speculating, and not in a good way. The media will eat this up if they find out. Millionaire's latest project, street girl turned business consultant." Smith's jaw tightened. He didn't care about appearances. But for the first time in years, he found himself questioning his own motives. Why had he brought Emily in? At first it was curiosity, an impulsive challenge to his own predictability. But now, watching her navigate a world she had no business being in, he felt something else. Was it admiration? Or was it something far more dangerous? Doubt. Later that night, Smith found Emily on the hotel's rooftop, staring out at the city skyline. "You didn't embarrass me today," he said, joining her. "That's impressive." Emily smirked. "I wasn't trying to impress you." Smith studied her. "Then what are you trying to do?" She hesitated, and for the first time since they met, he saw something crack beneath her confidence. "I had a life once," she said finally. "A real one, with plans, a future, and then it all got taken away." Smith remained silent, sensing the weight behind her words. "My father was a businessman," she continued. "Not like you. He wasn't rich. But he was smart. He built something from nothing, and then— She exhaled sharply. Then he trusted the wrong people. He lost everything. We lost everything. Smith frowned. And you ended up on the streets? Emily nodded. I learned the hard way that no one cares about the ones who fall. People step over you. They pretend you don't exist. She turned to him, eyes cold. Just like you did. Smith's stomach twisted. He had no excuse. I saw your name on the news a few months ago, she admitted. Saw how you crushed a smaller competitor in a merger deal. That company? My father worked for them. Smith inhaled sharply. Emily. Don't apologize, she cut him off. I'm not looking for pity. Smith stared at her, realization sinking in. She hadn't just been an observer today. She had been testing him, and he had just walked right into her game. Smith stood there, the weight of Emily's words pressing down on him like a boulder. Saw how you crushed a smaller competitor in a merger deal. That company? My father worked for them. His mind raced, sifting through past acquisitions. He had made dozens of deals, absorbed countless companies, erased names and histories without a second thought. But now, one had a face. One had her face. Emily's expression was unreadable, but her fingers were clenched into tight fists at her sides. The air between them was thick with something Smith rarely felt: accountability. For the first time in his career, the consequences of his actions weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were standing in front of him, staring him down with fire in their eyes. Which company? Smith asked, his voice quieter than usual. Emily let out a hollow laugh. Funny. I figured you wouldn't even remember. Tell me. She turned to him, crossing her arms. Ever heard of Brightwell Innovations? Smith stilled. Brightwell. A small but promising tech startup specializing in AI-driven business solutions. Smith had bought them out 2 years ago, absorbing their patents and dissolving the company itself. Their CEO had fought hard, refusing to sell until Smith cornered them financially, leaving them no choice but to fold. The CEO. Your father was Robert Carter, Smith said, realization dawning. Emily's jaw clenched. Yes. Smith exhaled sharply. He had met Robert Carter only once. A desperate man in his late 50s pleading to keep his company alive, not just for himself, but for his employees, his family. And Smith had crushed him. After you took Brightwell, Emily continued, her voice razor-sharp, he tried to rebuild. He really believed he could, but no one wanted to hire the man who failed. His credibility was gone. He burned through our savings trying to start over. Smith swallowed hard. What happened to him? Emily's gaze darkened. He died 6 months later. Heart attack. The words hit Smith like a physical blow. He had expected anger, hatred, maybe even a slap across the face. But this was worse. Emily shook her head, looking away. I lost everything that day. Our home, our future, and I was just left behind. Smith inhaled, his mind spinning. That wasn't— He stopped himself before he could say my fault. Because wasn't it? He had built his empire on ruthless efficiency, on eliminating competition before it became a threat. He had told himself it was just business, that the people who lost in the process weren't his problem. But now, standing face to face with the living consequence of one of those decisions, it didn't feel like just business anymore. Emily studied him. You're looking at me like I'm some kind of ghost. Maybe you are. She huffed a laugh. Good. You should be haunted. Smith ran a hand through his hair, stepping back. He needed to think, to process. But Emily wasn't finished. You want to know why I agreed to this ridiculous bet? She asked. Smith looked at her warily. Why? Emily took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. To see if you're actually capable of change. Smith's breath caught. She wasn't here for revenge. She wasn't here for pity. She was here to test him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he would pass. Smith had always believed that power came from control, from strategy, from knowing the game better than anyone else. But for the first time, he felt powerless. Emily's revelation had dismantled the walls he had built around himself. Every decision, every ruthless move, had consequences, ones he had ignored until now. Yet what haunted him most wasn't guilt. It was the opportunity he had missed. If he had looked beyond numbers, beyond spreadsheets and stock values, would Robert Carter still be alive? Would Emily have had a different life? Smith sat at his office desk, staring at the city skyline. For years, this view had been his trophy. Now, it felt hollow. A knock at the door. Emily. "I won't apologize for what I did," he said before she could speak. "I can't change the past." "I know." Her voice was steady, but there was something different about it. Less anger, more exhaustion. Smith took a breath. "But I can change what I do next." He slid a file across the desk. Emily hesitated before picking it up. She scanned the document, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "You're setting up a fund in my father's name? For small businesses, startups that need a real chance." Smith met her eyes. No loopholes, no hidden buyouts, just a second chance. Emily's grip on the paper tightened. "Why?" "Because you were right." His voice was softer now. "I need to change. And you? You gave me the chance to see that." Silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time since they met, Emily exhaled. Not in frustration, not in anger, but in relief. "It won't fix everything," she said finally. Smith nodded. "I know." A small smile ghosted her lips. "But it's a start." As she turned to leave, Smith called after her. "Emily." She paused. "Would he have forgiven me?" Emily didn't answer right away. She looked at him, really looked, before offering a quiet reply. "I don't know." Then she was gone. Smith leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers in front of him. Maybe forgiveness wasn't something he could ask for. Maybe redemption wasn't something he could buy. But for the first time, he was willing to try. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Power isn't just about winning. It's about the choices we make when given a second chance. Would you have forgiven Smith? Let me know in the comments.